protein was what I was really missing.
Yeah, that's cool.
That would be great. The delicate, like sort of gastro
What is the head of the
options that are here, I think it's difficult to figure out that diet right now. I'm not sure if something is.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to try to keep 45 minutes maybe for discussion, make sure everyone has a chance to talk, bring that last 20 minutes to
It's not three-dimensional, everyone just, you know.
We are debating the species of the mask.
It's a pinata, no specific animal.
Okay.
Just a pinata. Nothing to see here.
I'll just be here representing the fandoms that couldn't be here, the bronies and the furries, who I think had a big impact on the online scene. So I want to make sure all the online cons are represented here.
I see.
Is LD Lewis still coming to this?
Yes, just emailed, so they'll be on shortly.
Okay, we have 10 minutes, so we should be okay.
Plenty of time. I just got here from Zealand.
Yeah, shall we
What's the minute?
take us along slightly, because we've only got four
Yeah, we'll make
person
sure
lines,
that
so we may need to,
How many, we have total?
Five.
Okay, so we're like short.
Yes.
So one of you would have to share a mic, and I think what I'm going to do is allow all of you to introduce yourselves and keep the night brief. Maybe touch on the con that you were involved with during the pandemic, or which activities you were doing. I think I'm going to start down there and work our way all the way up here, and that should be perfect again.
Oh, hi. My air tag is completed. My luggage is left behind at the Hyatt.
Purely.
It's on the other tower, so I'm farther from it. I'm still here. It's not actually my luggage right now, it's in a drawer. My furniture.
Co-chair for the virtual.
But it thinks I'm at another.
About 40 minutes of discussion between us, and then the last couple of questions answered. If we don't have enough questions answered, this will be a session. And I'm going to leave the last minute for everyone to sign off and plug your social media projects you're working on. So that should give everyone a thank you. Everyone having a good Worldcon so far?
Yeah.
Anyone just come from a convention? Okay, I just came from a con in Seattle, and right before a con in Denver, and I have a con in Minneapolis next week, so I have a bunch of cons back to back. This is a fun con. So who here has ever been to Worldcon? Just curious. Okay, so we have a few Worldcon people. You've all enjoying the panels so far? Okay, that sounds good. I guess any panels you folks are on that later that you want to, I guess, invite people to?
I don't know what I'm doing, to be honest. If it is anyone's first Worldcon or you want a tour of the space, I'm leading a convention tour where I'll, walk you around everything and show you everything is and answer any questions. But it's pretty helpful because I did one on Wednesday for staff, and so now I roughly know where everything is and how all these escalators fit together.
Crazy, you're doing staff and also panelists. Seems like a lot of work.
I think there's quite a few actually. I mean, my staff stuff is like 1 or 2 hours a day, and I did some prep on Wednesday, so it's not. I guess it's not any more than if I was doing I'm only doing panels. I have like autographing, some table talks. Or, I think some people have a lot more program stuff. So.
My other big thing that I'm doing here is the WizFest business meeting. Mostly for the purposes of creating a Hugo Award category for games, all kinds of games. If you're interested in that, please come vote. We are likely up on the agenda Sunday, not Saturday, because the preliminary meeting got very exciting and ran over.
As games do.
Well, that was, the preliminary meeting was like setting the agenda, and usually setting the agenda is not very exciting. But this year, yeah.
No, the preliminary meeting is usually where all the exciting stuff happens.
Well, that's a big problem too.
Oh.
Do you have any?
I have no idea. I'm so sleepy, guys. This has been, I've been on sensory overload for like 48 hours. So tomorrow at 1, I'm doing the prize culture of SFF, because I do also run an award series. And then the state of black speculative fiction will be I guess a virtual only thing. So hi people on Airbnb. And then,
The content is yet.
you know stuff.
We'll stream
That's
directly
fun.
on the dot.
Yeah.
That's how it works. Okay, I guess just give us a heads up. See.
All of my people are on Airbnb.
Doing 1940, the first ShitCon, so we're gonna talk about the first time Worldcon, technically the second Worldcon was held here in Chicago. So that's gonna be a fun history panel. Then I'm doing the problematic history of ... So I'm guessing that's a problematic history of science fiction tomorrow at 7 p.m. And then appropriation versus integration Sunday at 1 p.m. So as a queer minority, there's a lot of topics there I want to touch on that I think a lot of people misinterpret or get wrong.
And I have a table talk at 2:30 tomorrow. In the unlikely event that you're a fan of Buckaroo Banzai, I run for the newsletter for many decades, or for a couple of decades, and it's been around for many more than that. So come on by, it's great.
Looks like we still have about 4 minutes, so I'm actually curious, so maybe we might touch on certain topics. Are there any specific topics or events you want us to touch on during this panel? Raise your hands if you want to suggest anything.
I mean, I'm kind of interested in hearing how y'all dealt with challenges about people who are either anti-science, anti-vax, anti-mask. I mean, how do you deal with people like that when you can't just tell them not to come?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes, but sometimes not.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, especially when a lot of the cons I was helping with, they can't control the entire hotel space. You go and control your certain area, and that causes some issues as well, especially how you were to release saying mask in our area, but we can't control outside. Everyone thinks, oh, you're not masking everywhere. It's like, no, we can't control that space. So we'll definitely touch on that. Yes.
I really want to hear more about FIACon, because
Okay,
I attended both and it was amazing.
I would like to hear about how the convention decides on COVID policy. I've been doing a lot of advising about that, and different groups do different things.
Yeah, I think addendum to that, probably talk about how each local state and local law has a different rules for that. Okay.
Some people give me ribbons and I've like not got around to actually listening. And I don't want this to turn a trail
Yeah.
to the ground.
Yeah.
Like there's gonna be a limit.
Triple
But
hazard, definitely.
yeah.
You technically have 2 badges, so you can always do a double runner.
It's true, I could just like loop around and sing on it.
Yeah.
The Mobius strip of convention badges.
There you go.
Yeah, I specifically only kept
You can
ribbons
run
I
them along
needed
the
and already
sides.
pretty long, so.
Yeah, I kept the ones that I felt I actually needed kind of up at the top, but probably didn't need
That's
all
what
of them.
Worldcon's all about, the ribbon collecting. Like I've seen people actually make vests out of all the ribbons they have.
There's a quilt at the art sale that's made out of convention ribbons.
Wow.
Wow.
I guess that's one thing virtual cons can't really do. Can't have the fun ribbon collections.
There's a will.
Unless you send it out by mail, which I know some cons ended up doing. Alright, looks like we're about a minute out, so. I guess just let us know when we're ready.
Whenever you want to start, I can go.
Okay, I think everyone's here, so let's get started. welcome everybody.
It's gonna go live in
Okay.
5 seconds, so it is on the delay, so.
All right, welcome everybody to the con.
Sorry.
It's still
It says connecting now.
It says there's a countdown anyway, so now.
Good.
All right, welcome everybody to the Con Running in the Age of COVID panel. So this is a panel where we're going to discuss the conflicts of having to run virtual cons during the pandemic and cons, especially hybrid cons post-pandemic. I'm going to allow my panelists to introduce themselves, going from right to left, and then we're going to get started. We're going to do about 40 minutes of discussion between us, and then we're going to save the last 20 minutes for questions and answers. So if you have questions, try to save them towards the end so we don't interrupt any of the panelists. So with that, I'm going to allow our panelists to introduce themselves.
Right, great, thank you. My name is Ira Alexandra, pronouns they, them. I ran the first online WizCon in 2020 that was fully virtual, and the hybrid WizCon in 2022, our first hybrid event.
I'm LD Lewis, pronouns she, her. I am the founder of the virtual only FIACon, which centered the experiences and contributions of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in speculative literature, and we were Hugo nominated for that last year. And I was also the chair of the virtual Nebula conference in 2021.
Hi, I'm Liz Batty, she, hers. I'm a UK con runner, and during the pandemic I ran a couple of virtual only online conventions with some friends. I've also been involved in helping run this hybrid Worldcon and a little bit with some of the first in-person cons back in the UK. And I also do a podcast on science fiction fandom, where we've talked a lot about COVID policies and attitudes to COVID and how different cons have approached them differently and maybe what some of the differences in outcome have been.
I'm Dan Berger. I've been associated with Capricorn here in Chicago during our last convention, which was our first one back in person after the last couple of years. I've also was a volunteer with the Medical Reserve Corps, primarily during the spike of 2020, when we were addressing the call volume of that spike at the time and gearing up for vaccinations and all the phone calls that came in as a result of that. And then afterwards, I did a 3-month stint actually working at the vaccination site. So I've seen a lot of COVID from a lot of different angles. It's been a journey.
All right. And I'm the moderator. I'm Alex Moy, they, them. I graduated from Johns Hopkins University. That's the university that was tracking the COVID cases as they were happening in the United States. I'm also working on the convention history book, so I've been tracking the history of cons from the early sci-fi cons to the modern day. I was about to publish the book right before the pandemic, and then all this happened, so I knew I had to save the chapter for the virtual online cons. I'm mostly going to be moderating this panel, but I'm going to also represent 2 fandoms that really got the ball rolling for the virtual cons, the Bronies and the Furry fandom, very, very tech-savvy fandoms. They created virtual cons through VR and Second Life in creative fashion, so I just wanted to make sure there was a little representation, especially since a lot of these cons were founded by trans individuals, trans women, so showing the diverse side of the tech side of the fandom. So I think to begin, I want to, each of you had an experience either chairing, founding, or converting a pre-existing con into a virtual event or hybrid event, and I kind of want to get a brief summation of the instigation of what was the idea that sparked, okay, let's shift online, and what were some of the learning curves you found trying to get that started? So I think we'll start with Ira and work our way down here.
Okay.
That works?
It's Ira, sorry.
Oh, Ira, sorry.
Well, in 2020, we went online. The thing is, we had no budget, and I mean $0, none. Our budget was tied up in contracts, and the con was canceled, and that budget money had to go to the next contract. And that budget money didn't go anywhere. That's our next contract. We fell under force majeure, so our contract was canceled. We didn't have to pay it, et cetera, but that also meant that, you know, we had nothing to work with. So we ended up putting on a pretty minimal event, but we really wanted to keep kind of the spirit of the convention going. Didn't want it to like fizzle out just because of COVID. In 2022, in 21, the hotel let us host a smaller non-WisCon event that I was not involved with. But in 2022, because of like the health regulations all falling to the side, we had to have an in-person event. And the hotel like worked with us as much as they could, but yeah, it was the hotel contract. We were locked in. We did not have the budget to like eat the fees, which were over $100,000. So that would have killed us. And we had to either hold the safest event we could or no more WisCons ever.
I'm gonna alternate mics because I can. All right, so FireCon came about pretty much because of COVID, and then the overlap of a few different world events. So first we had, there'd been a pattern of observation, particularly from a lot of marginalized communities where they were receiving a somewhat lesser experience from traditional kind of in-person conventions. And that's something that we kind of kept track of for a while, me specifically, just because I'm nosy. So we had kind of this track record of things that were failing certain segments of the community, whether it was people of different ethnic or racial marginalizations being sort of pigeonholed into certain topics on programming, being put into positions of being the token on programming, so the only non-white person on a panel. There were accessibility issues that were kind of recurring in some of the longer running conventions. And so these things were sort of recurring themes every time convention season kind of rolled around. And then in the summer of 2020, the Black Lives Matter thing kind of took off. I also run Fire Literary Magazine, which is a magazine of Black speculative fiction. We are also on the Hugo ballot again this year and won last year. But because of who we are and what we represent, and especially at that time, we all of a sudden got this huge influx of cash. People wanting to show that Black art mattered. And so we were able to do a lot of doing sort of a convention or a workshop or a retreat was sort of a pipe dream when we got started maybe 6 years ago. But with the advent of COVID, we were able to, it kind of made virtual events more viable. And so we saw an opportunity to kind of address some of the concerns of the community that we've been observing, and put some of the extra funds we had to use to kind of develop FireCon, which we ran for 2 years. The first year, when I ended up being nominated for a Hugo for Best Related Work. It was a contentious thing, and it was great, but I got an extra pin for it, so it's fine. It is beloved, and I'm very proud of that. Like, we skipped this year. We had some harassment issues and things last year. Staff kind of got tuckered out a bit, so we kind of took a break this year. But for people to still be talking about their experience for those 2 years that we did it, we had a 24-hour programming slate. We were able to bring in panelists from all over the world, people who have traditionally been left out of programming just because of where they are, or people in the traditional con running circuit, they don't know of these people. You know, you sometimes see the same names kind of getting called to be on panels and things. So we were able to open up the SFF experience to literally an international audience and sort of foster community in that way, and made it as interactive as we could. We centered the people before the content, which I think is something that kind of fails some other places, not Worldcon specifically, but yeah, it was, I'm glad that I still get called to talk about it, because we only did it twice. Is that right? There you go.
So basically in the UK, one of the kind of the big events is the EasterCon, which would happen every year at Easter. And because that was so close to the start of the first lockdown, there was no virtual option. It just completely folded because it was early April. And I think a friend of mine, Alison Scott, started to realize that a lot of people, you know, they were missing their kind of contact with their friends, they were missing, you know, being able to socialize with people, and she started basically a daily kind of coffee morning for everyone kind of in UK science fiction fandom or adjacent, you know, to come and just get some social time with people. And we decided, okay, we combine that with this tradition they have in the UK of kind of fun cons, of like weekends where you're coming to a science fiction convention, but the program is kind of almost equally as important as kind of the socializing time and how you interact with people. And so we set up these online cons we call them Punctuation, and there was just kind of 4 or 5 of us who ran them for one weekend, and we tried to do everything virtually, and what we were trying to do is try and bring people together to kind of have an experience, a social experience as much as anything else for that weekend, like they might at a science fiction convention. And so, you know, we were looking at things like, you know, we did it all on Zoom and Discord. When we started, we weren't really sure how much money we were going to need to do this, so I think we, you know, charged everyone a $5 or something, which is about as little as you can get away with charging. You know, and we tried things like, you know, we're going to have a breakfast session, everyone can come and have breakfast, and we had like a wine tasting and a beer tasting and a cheese tasting where everyone did them kind of remotely from their room. So it was just kind of to bring these people together and see if at this time when, you know, the UK was in a very strict lockdown, could we actually like get some social interaction with the people that you'd normally be seeing in person. And they were UK focused, but we had enough people from other time zones that some parts of them did keep going about 18, 20 hours a day. Yeah, and that's what we did. We did a couple of those, and now we're thinking about, do we want to do a third one? Do we do another virtual convention, or do we try and take the energy from that into a hybrid or in-person event? And we really haven't decided yet.
So in 2019, Capricorn was still at the Westin in Wheeling, which is a northern suburb of Chicago here. And we were getting to the point where we had to figure out what our next home was going to be, which turned out to be a hotel across the river here in Chicago, downtown, which is a very different situation, obviously, in terms of both the logistics and the expense involved. So we ran our last con at the Wheeling location in 2020 on February. Then March hit. And fortunately that benefited us in one way, in that we had a 12-month window to figure stuff out. So 2021 we did put on a virtual convention, and we had, you know, the benefit and luxury of a certain amount of time to figure out what that meant and how to address it. Then we actually had to do a live one in just this year in 2022, and that's when we benefited from knowing how to run a virtual con, but also had the challenge, both logistically and in terms of resource management, of dealing now with 2 conventions at the same time. You know, we talk about hybrid conventions, and it kind of sounds like it's one piece, and it's really not. One of the biggest challenges, I think, is the fact that I work in the brewing industry. It's a lot like working at a brewery that also serves food. You're not just a brew pub at that point. You're actually 2 businesses. You're a brewery and a restaurant, and they do 2 very different things. They might be related, but it complicates everything. So the hybrid conventions are very much in that same modality. So that's kind of where we are now.
Do you have something to add?
Alex, would you kindly let me elaborate a little bit, because
Sure,
in my nerves are just
Yep, no worries.
talking about only the facts. So, for those who don't know, Worldcon is a feminist speculative fiction convention. I believe we're in our late 40th year coming up, and a big aspect of Worldcon has always been the community and the acceptance. Like we've had a lot of struggles as any con with accessibility and racism and trans misogyny, but you know, we always try to handle that in a, like, with growth, you know, try to get better every year. But when we were looking at doing our first virtual con, like I said, we had 0 budget, but we really wanted to keep that community aspect. And we didn't really have people on staff who were super familiar with like any kind of virtual events. And we that was the first year we ran a Discord, and that was a smash hit. Like, people felt with the Discord that they actually attended the con. Our programming was minimal, but people said it felt like a WizCon. We had, maybe like a dozen program items, it was tiny. But the convention happened according to the attendees. So yeah, we faced a lot more challenges in 2021. In theory, we had more knowledge, we had more resources, but as my fellow panelists have been saying, there's a specific challenge to hybrid events that is different from solely virtual or solely in-person events. So we had to have an in-person event, and it was a struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll touch on that a little bit next, but I do want to put an input. So doing the con history, it made sense when the quarantine happened. The community that was most recently born online, the Brony community, was the first to kind of do the online con during the pandemic. They were already doing JokiCon since 2013 online. Courses at Home Con was a famous Tumblr convention that the Brony fandom did. It started with support the vendors hashtag that was started by a Brony artist, and she basically created a Discord group on March 20th, 2020, so very quickly right after the quarantine happened, and created a Discord group for vendors who are now displaced from all these cons who find a way to vendor wares. One of my friends, Dex, basically took that and ran with it, bring all her techie friends. They basically created PonyFest Online, which on record is the first post-pandemic con. They basically did a unique hybrid situation. They incorporated the dealer's room from the Discord, incorporated a Zoom call to do live panels. They even did live autograph signings by guest of honors, and eventually incorporated music into the scene. Because this was the first time Bronies from around the world could actually participate in a US Brony convention, they got inspired, and in Southeast Asia, one Brony convention online basically recreated a convention center in Minecraft and had all the panels streamed in individual Minecraft rooms. And of course, you know, the furries had to one-up the Bronies, and the furries basically recreated convention centers in Second Life. And you think about furries, you know, you're wearing your avatar at con, so it made sense digital avatars would work in a Second Life environment. So you had all these furry cons that are now canceled, shifting to an online model, recreating their convention center in Second Life, and basically using their persona avatar to interact and integrate. And it's really cool and creative. I think there's some videos out there if you want to see how they recreate the convention centers, have the panel room streaming. There was even one that had a dealer's hall where you could take a picture of your booth, upload it, and it has a virtual booth in the actual convention center, which I thought was really, really unique and very creative. And I do want to shout out that there's a lot of misinterpretations about Bronies being, you know, all crazy males, but the first BronyCon was founded by trans women, and it makes perfect sense that the first online PonyCons during the pandemic were founded by trans women as well. So I definitely want to shout them out for getting that ball rolling. All right, so I talked about how the Bronies and the furries incorporated Discord and Zoom. How did your events incorporate, I guess, specific online mediums? Because especially, this was new. If you guys seen what New Zealand was doing, the New Zealand Worldcon, it kind of had some hiccups. So I guess we'll start with you and just talk about how the con ran online, what programs you used, and what you learned from that.
Okay. At least with a hybrid event, because I really wasn't very much present for the first virtual convention. But we're doing Zoom rooms, and there was a Discord, a series of Discord channels. It all seemed to work pretty well. Probably the biggest challenge was actually getting staffing for the virtual portion of it, because you know at that point you're essentially, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, you're beefing up the staff to kind of not exactly twice of what it was, but it's not, you know, there is an increase in terms of number of head count that you need to manage things properly. There was nothing that was devastating or catastrophic, or you know, maybe some minor glitches, but that's technology all over. So it went well, but it was, you know, trying to make sure that it got to the point where it could run well. That was really the hard part.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, so I think when you say, how did you incorporate Discord and Zoom, we basically did it just on Discord and Zoom, because it was a pretty small con, but it also had some advantages. You can set your Discord up for free early on, and you can run test Zoom events. And I think what we really wanted was to make sure no one was left behind because they couldn't cope with the technology we were using, or they didn't have enough familiarity to get into it. So we did things like, okay, we'll get you all on Discord. That's going to be our primary, method of communication. And once you're there, we can help you get up and running on Zoom. We also kind of got the first one we did use a few kind of interactive tools, these sort of Slido style tools that you can run through Zoom and screen sharing to do some more interactive stuff. But actually we didn't use those a huge amount, and we just basically went back to Discord and Zoom. I will say that the first virtual EasterCon, which ran in 2021, tried using GatherTown instead, which I do think has a lot of pluses, but it also had a lot of minuses, and I think they got a lot of pushback about that because it felt overly complicated and it felt quite difficult to access for a lot of people, especially those using low-end hardware. So we've just gone back to Discord and Zoom, which it worked fine, and also had the advantage of being a very, very affordable way of running like a small virtual con. Once you work out kind of how many big Zoom sessions you need, that's your main cost.
Yes, I know. So our first year we did Zoom and Discord, and that went really well. I think we did Zoom because I believe at that time the Nebulas had done their first virtual on Zoom. And so when we decided that we were going to actually do a con, we received a lot of mentorship from some of the larger organizations who had to pivot. So CIFA was one of those. And also gave us kind of our starter funds too, I forgot about that. But we kind of structured it after kind of what their setup was first. And that went really well. We had a very robust kind of community policy, harassment, and different reporting procedures that really didn't end up needing to be enforced, just because I think of the community we attracted, which was great. Because as we started this as kind of a response to situations where people were dealing with harassment and microaggressions and stuff, we wanted to make sure we had things in place. But I think people who gravitated toward us kind of knew that already. So that was awesome. The Discord was also pretty robust. My Discord wizard Coral, if you're somewhere watching. None of that could have happened without them. So I think we ended up with something like 1,200, just over 1,000 attendees the first year. And so them being able to navigate both of those spaces and still feel as though they were attending an event and not just kind of consuming content and being able to interact, I think that was important. Our second year, because of, I believe, Worldcon's success with AirMeet, we pivoted to AirMeet. It was more of an all-in platform. Apologies for some of the difficulties I've been seeing on social media with what people have been experiencing here. AirMeet was not a perfect platform. We had to harass them a lot to make certain adjustments based on what our community needed, specifically around accessibility for a lot of different countries. So they were somewhat, I'm not going to badmouth them since we are on AirMeet. Hi, AirMeet. They did what they could, and then we cribbed somewhat from Worldcon's alternative accessibility and captions methods that they use that had to kind of plug into AirMeet to get the system to work for some people, but we had to create kind of orientation videos and get those out in advance to make sure people know that they have these options available to them, things like that. So AirMeet created kind of new issues. We sacrificed some convenience on the administrative side in order to provide a more immersive experience for people who were just attending. But as we were tearing our hair out, it wasn't evident to anybody who was there to just enjoy themselves, so that was nice. The booth feature is also pretty cool, which was something we wanted to, it was something that we definitely felt was missing from the first year, just being limited to Zoom and Discord. So AirMeet with their booth features gave us something that we could offer sponsors, community partners, small businesses, people who Since we were attracting an international audience, we wanted to be able to kind of showcase what they were doing locally via the platform. And so that kind of gave our audience a bigger audience themselves. So that was nice.
We were, I think, one of the minority who did not use Zoom the first time around. In 2020, we actually used a meeting platform called Jitsi. And we did this for a couple of reasons. As a very long-running feminist event, Worldcon has often been under threat by hostile parties. And we had, like, in the early days of the pandemic, our convention is over Memorial Day weekend. So this was not very far, into everyone getting their tech stuff sorted out. And there were a lot of reports of like bombing Zoom meetings, fascists acting as fascists do. So a lot of us did not feel very safe using Zoom. So we had to kind of jury rig a bit with Jitsi and streaming to YouTube and funneling funneling questions from Discord to the panelists in Jitsi via like production assistants and like a whole complicated stream of like this person doing this portion of the job and breaking it down, which also meant that as was mentioned, we had to find enough staff for all of our programming, and that's one reason that we had so few panels that year, is we had to have like the tech people, the people to communicate between Jitsi and Discord, the people checking the Twitter tag, the people making sure the YouTube stream was working. So that was pretty complicated. In the hybrid con that we ran in 2022, we did use Zoom. By this point, we're all familiar that Zoom added a whole bunch of features, security, like breakout rooms, et cetera, et cetera. So it's gotten like pretty sophisticated. However, we still did face pushback and concerns on ethical and international grounds, as some of our international members were not able to attend the Zoom panel safely. Possibly you could speak to that. So it wasn't problem-free. It was a little bit hard to swallow with like the kind of ethos that we try to follow, but it was the best solution we could find at the time. With the most documentation, the most experience from other cons, and so on.
Okay. I think for the next few topics, I'm just going to address different points, and individual panelists could raise their hands and cover them. But I think since you already started talking about the hybrid events and the cons coming back post, I guess, shutdown, I think that's the one thing I want to bring up next, because I remember the con I just came from, Everfree Northwest. The first year it came back, there's the issue of not being able to control the entire hotel, and they wanted to enforce mask policies, but they could only enforce it within their area. So outside the hotels, if there's party rooms that are outside of the con block, they can't be managed. Another issue I saw was because a lot of the guests of honors they pulled were from Vancouver and Canada. A lot of VAs that were originally supposed to fly down because of the border being closed could not go down there, so they had to integrate things like doing a virtual signing where they'll have like a little webcam set up so you can interact with the VA all the way in Canada, and they'll mail you the autograph signing. But with issues like that, with controlling masks and policies, and then of course there's always the risk, you probably saw on social media, anti-maskers saying they're going to bombard the con and disrupt it. What experiences did you folks go through when cons basically came back and you had to hold in person?
Yeah, I can speak specifically to the aspect of physical spaces and controlling physical spaces. Worldcon is a smallish con run in a smallish hotel. We usually have a little under 1,000 attendees and sell out the hotel. So we control basically all the spaces on a normal non-pandemic year. And in 2022, this year, we couldn't do either one safely. We could not have 1,000 attendees safely, and have the same number of people in every room as we usually did. But by token of having an attendance cap, our attendance cap was 600. It also meant that people who were not subject to our policies were in the hotel. So this was a very difficult trade-off. And it, there were some spaces where masking was especially iffy, even though a lot of our members were there, like a lot of people who weren't from our convention were there, and we couldn't do anything about it. In terms of like our actual membership, they were all very good about masking. Like we didn't have any actual issues.
That's
But
good.
yeah. And the hotel itself, we have a very long-running relationship with our hotel. I believe we've been held there our entire history, maybe, so like 40+ years. It's a unionized hotel, that's why we picked them. And they're usually very nice to us, but they also, they could not get their employees to mask 100% of the time. They could get the employees to mask in our spaces, but they couldn't get all the employees to mask all the time.
I think on the, you also brought up when you talked about the hotel, the contract is enforced. So for cons that were already an in-person con that had to shift online and then shift back, I think that was a problem I saw a lot on Twitter, because especially within some of those con circles I'm at, some cons announced they were canceled because of the pandemic, and other cons, because of the contract of hotel, were forced to still promote the dates that are, even though they knew they would be canceled, within the week, they still had to promote it, and they were called out. And finally, when they said, okay, finally, the hotel said yes, we have to do it. They're like, okay, finally, what took so long? Well, because of the contract issues, and some cons had to host like smaller events when they came back. So there was a con in Columbus, Ohio that had a contract. They had to hold a con in 2021. So they held a small event in December because they were forced to, even though they were a summer event. Same one, the bigger cons in Reno, Biggest Little Fur Con, they normally have a con every May, but because they were forced to have a con that year, they had a smaller event in October. So that just shows you kind of the issues there is from the con staffer's perspective that they had to deal with. Did you experience any of that with your cons coming back? Because you had Capricorn, right?
Right.
Yeah, so was there any contract with the hotel beforehand?
Yeah, so they were actually pretty forgiving because, well, I mean, I'm not gonna get into the depths of it because you all, I know, need to sleep eventually, but it doesn't need to be now. But yeah, I think the biggest things were managing expectations as far as going into, interestingly enough, a union situation, because the resource management changed significantly at that point. And I think Chicago, generally speaking, because it's a much more resource intensive environment. So, you got this much money here, it really equates about this much money there. You've already been through the cycle of, having a year where you didn't get a revenue year because of having a virtual convention. I mean, it just kind of cascades in that respect. But I'm sorry, my ADHD is going.
No worries.
What was the other part?
Well, was there any issues with the hotel contract that you were forced to hold a con?
Right. So, I guess the upside for that was that the convention was in a situation where they understood that, there's only so much that we can do to bring people to a convention when it's being held live. And so they were definitely not as strict on enforcing terms of the contract. There was a little bit more give there. And you knew that it was only going to be for this year, it wasn't going to be eternal forgiveness. But it was one of those things where it worked out. It didn't work out ideally. I think we only had like half the attendance that we normally would, and that is, creates cascading problems going forward, especially when you're still in this hotel that costs a bit of money compared to your previous situation. But yeah, that's kind of where we were. It wasn't all bad.
Okay.
Yeah. Our hotel really tried to work with us,
Yeah.
but they still have to pay their employees.
Yes, yeah.
And we want them to pay their employees. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember the first few cons, because I'm an artist vendor at these conventions. I remember the first one, they had to put big spaces in between each table, so it was a really downsized dealer's hall, spaces in between table, and they basically had a taped off path where attendees had to walk to go to each table, and you can only have one party in front of your table each time. So that was one of the, the in-between transitions to coming back full force. I think they kind of brought that all back. But one thing I noticed during the pandemic, especially with the virtual cons, I like to call it was the great equalizer, because normally fandoms and groups that never got as much recognition for running cons, so not just, Bronies and Furries do fantastic cons, and it really showed compared to, when they went online, they were well better run than big, San Diego Comic-Con trying to do an online event, but also smaller events, POC voices, queer voices, feminist voices who normally would be too afraid to host a con, were able to do a virtual con and prove they were successful. And I think that's a good topic to touch on, because I think each of the cons we're involved with at least touched with some area that the mainstream audience might worry would not work in that as an in-person convention. So, anyone wants to touch on that?
I feel like that was pointed at me.
You got the Hugo
yeah,
nomination, so yeah, perfect.
It was definitely something we did because we could.
You said you've been wanting to do it for a while now.
Yeah, it was one of those things, because up until 2020, we've kind of been, kicking around with the same 300, 400 as subscribers to the magazine, and we had to do an annual kind of subscription drive just to kind of sustain the magazine entity itself every year. But then we had all of this money all of a sudden, and we were like, hey, so I'm tired of yelling about cons that I've actually never been to. I never, up until that point, been to a literary convention. I was just always watching the upsetness happening. The same conversation just kind of happening, and the spirit of FIA is itself is kind of like a, fuck it, we'll do it. Like, at that point, when we became a thing, it was because Black writers only existed as, I believe, 2.3% of the published field. And so we were told that it was because Black writers didn't exist, or we didn't write quality literature to warrant being published. So we made a magazine, and now we're, Hugo nominated a bunch of times. So in the spirit of that, we were like, okay, well, convention system seems to be failing a bunch of people. We know how not to do that. And so we put together the thing, because we could, and it was kind of just an experiment, just the first year, but it was so well received, and we saw opportunities to improve on the first year by doing it again, and I think we increased by like another 300 attendees the second year, mostly based off the passion everybody had for the first year's event. And it kind of keeps coming up. It won't die. So we'll see if it comes back. But it was definitely, COVID happened. It would have been much more expensive at any point, even with the influx of cash we got to attempt an in-person event. And then in the spirit of the accessibility that we were trying to pursue, the being internationally inclusive, that would have been more difficult had we tried to, physical cons are cost preventative for a lot of people. And so being able to do it virtually, keeping our costs low, keeping admission prices low, we were able to bring in so many different people, and nobody was kind of cut out. And so that's one of the things, like, as we kind of pursue hybrid events, you have to be aware of the reach you had while you were doing a virtual event, and be aware of the doors you'll be, how many faces you'll be shutting doors in if you return to focusing specifically on an in-person. And that may mean revisiting how you structure your staff. It is going to take more people, and some of those people want to be paid. And so figuring out ways to accommodate that, to actually attract talent, so you don't have these gaping holes in your staffing ability and your inability to take care of people while they're attending your event. So it's this little nuanced thing that's going to take some adjustments, but I really don't want us to focus specifically on a return to the normal way of doing things. I want to make sure that the people who felt included over the last couple of years by being to attend virtually continue to be considered.
So you think it's gonna still continue being virtual for the foreseeable future?
Yes.
Okay, that's good, because I think now that cons are coming back, everyone's trying to shift back to online
Right.
cons, and I think we missed the opportunity to continue these virtual cons, because like you were saying, there's the accessibility issues. Now we have international audience come, people who might not be able to physically attend the convention, able to attend. I want to, I guess, allow each of the panelists to probably quickly cover a topic that I probably didn't bring up before we turn it over questions and answers. But I guess I'll start off with Liz, since you didn't have as much time to talk. Is there any specific topic you wanted to cover that we didn't address yet?
I'm wondering if we can cover, when we do go back to kind of hybrid events, how do we make it feel like the people attending both sides of the hybrid event are at the same event? Because I feel, I mean, particularly watching people attending this Worldcon virtually, it kind of feels like we're at two entirely separate events. You know, there's a handful of items like this one where the virtual attendees are with us. But it kind of feels like we're just basically running two events that don't merge. And I think that's going to be a really kind of hard trick to pull off, but it's one that we have to, so that we don't leave the virtual attendees feeling like they're getting like a second class event.
Actually, I want to point out, I was just at a Furrycon in my hometown of Orlando, and they ran a virtual event along with their physical event. So this was in their main lounge area, and they had a screen set up where all the people could physically see the people in the VR world interacting. And this is a screenshot from someone who was in the VR world interacting with all the live people in the camera. And I thought that was and it was a life-size screen, so we could interact at the same height, which I don't think I've seen any con done before. So there was
I keep
a
yelling
way
at
to
cons
integrate
to
it.
do that.
This was a
It's been
cute
my
idea,
favorite, yeah.
and I would love to see future World Cons or just future cons do this in the future. I just think it's a cute idea, especially if you see giant cute animals at life size, you know. All right, so I guess since Liz already talked, Dan, you fill in with what you want to talk about, and then we'll finish off the rest before we open up the questions and answers. So
Okay.
anything we didn't cover yet?
All right. I do wonder if it makes sense in the future to basically split conventions rather than do a hybrid model into 2 conventions in a year, simply because doing both at the same time presents a lot of logistical issues in terms of, you know, resource management of your people. And, you know, that's obviously the way where you have maybe a 6-month window where you can recover from one, do one that, you know, with the same people rather than having to add, you know, another 15 people to keep going forward. I think beyond that, that kind of brings up the bigger question of what do conventions look like in the future? We're very much in a sort of, you know, in between time. We're still trying to figure that out, I think. We figured a lot of things out, but there's a lot of room for refinement and sort of, you know, continuous change. You know, as we slowly move into another space in terms of what health looks like in the United States. And, you know, especially how people deal with the anxiety of it all. I think that was one of the big things working for the Medical Reserve Corps that haunts me to this day, is dealing with those phone calls, and just how much fear and anxiety was pouring out of that phone most days. And it's something that has lingered, and it's probably going to continue to linger, and coming back from that is going to affect what happens to conventions in the future, because it's going to affect the choices that people make. So.
Possibly my biggest takeaway from the 2 events that we ran is the question of access. At Worldcon we have an access department, and this does not just mean accommodations for various disabilities. This also means access, financially access for people from different countries, access for people from different backgrounds. And something that was painful to learn is, well, we knew this already, but accommodating one person or one set of people will not infrequently put another set of people at a disadvantage. And that, for me, is the biggest thing that we need to work on as we continue to put on events, as we continue to have words with technology companies, and as we continue to reconceptualize physical spaces.
I don't think I have anything additional.
All right. I think we'll open open up to audience questions. Just kind of keep your hand up. You don't have to keep your hand up the entire time, but I'm gonna go make my way across the room. I think I'm gonna repeat the question, so kind of keep it nice and condensed. And if there's a specific panelist you want to address it to, make sure to say their name. All right, you first.
So I'm a con runner, but I'm also in my day job an AV technician for 24 years. And one thing I've been hearing from other techs that are helping with jobs is the amount of resistance con leadership has been having when techs have said, this is what we need, when the con leadership says this is what we want. Your thoughts on how to bridge that gap from leadership to the techs that are being asked to do everything with nothing?
And you're not
Might
the
you
first
give an
person.
example?
Yeah.
An example right now, actually, to tell, I am volunteering here for on-site air meet support, and there's 2 of us that are in face to be able to help someone at least get onto air meet so they can use the online support. And it was something that was being harped at a lot to, we need more physical support on site. And just, it wasn't, and I know volunteering is a thing, but it's like, it felt like there was resistance. And I've seen it at other cons, at Con Carolinas, at Congregate, at Dragon Con, at Jordan Con. It's been just a continuing fight that it's, yeah.
Okay, I think I understand. So it's basically bridging the gap between con leadership and what the tech, or I guess other cons would call AV, or the on-site tech crew would need. Any thoughts on that? For I guess in-person events?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of pieces going in here. One is a communication piece. It's figuring out how the 2 parties, because the 2 parties are probably approaching a single problem from 2 very different angles, and that negotiation can be difficult. There's some speaking 2 different languages, for lack of a better term, and some misunderstandings on both sides, more than likely, in terms of what the needs of the other party are in order to get to a center point where it works for both. The other thing is, I think that you're talking about a situation with a lot of convention runners right now where there's, again, a lot of anxiety, a lot of bandwidth being used up right now, a lot of resources that aren't necessarily available that can sometimes make for short answers. It's sort of like, I've got 17 different fires, but we've got this under control enough right now, so I've got to deal with these. And which is not ideal for either side. So I think a lot of it comes down to going back to that communication piece and just making sure that you're being heard and being heard functionally, in a sense that it's not putting anyone out. You're picking your moments in terms of the other person on the other side of that table isn't stressed out and is in a position can actually listen to you rather than just hear. So that's what I've got.
We were in a somewhat lucky position that the person who ended up running our online con department was herself a previous chair of WisCon. So she had a very good understanding of like the balancing act and all of that. Pursuant to that, we also realized after the con that running online con is a chair level position. And that it requires someone with the same resources and authority as the overall con chairs.
Yeah, and you brought up a point that already predated the online conventions, because especially within the con communities I am at, I know you have to have volunteers at a con. A lot of them are nonprofit cons, so you can't be paid, so oftentimes they're comped with rooms. I work directly with design teams for some conventions, and there's an issue where you have to pay artists for artwork. But if you pay artists, does that mean you have to pay the AV crew, especially when the AV needs a lot of money for running their events? Like, have you ever seen a rave at an anime con or furry con? They're like, a lot of the folks who do the furry cons I go to are like Disney Imagineers and stuff. So they're on that level and they're doing this for free. So at what point do we start compensating people? But at that point, do we compensate the chairs? Do we compensate this? It becomes a very tricky issue, especially when a con is non-profit versus a con that's for-profit. And even for-profit, you have to get into issues of employment. So I think that's something that all the cons are addressing now, but whether we'll know the answer, we're not sure yet. Right, yes.
Yes, so I'm both a con runner and a retired infectious disease epidemiologist. And so I've been involved a lot in setting COVID policies for places like DisCon and Worldcon and Capclave and gaming conventions. And they've mostly been in the same part of the country, so it's easier in that the culture is kind of the same. Whereas a convention down in Southern Virginia or in Florida is gonna have different constraints. But the question is, you know, given what you're able to do under the state laws that you're facing, how does the convention decide, you know, what to require of the members in order to hold an in-person event?
So what do the conventions require of members based on state laws? And I've seen this an issue where some cities, for example, LA will enforce a mask mandate, but the entire state of California will lift the mask mandate. So which government do you follow? And even cases where if a law is lifted, especially in Florida where you're not supposed to have masks, then how can you enforce a mask code when Florida is very conservative on this specific issue? So anyone wants to take this question?
Well, I mentioned that our membership was pretty cooperative, and WisCon is held in Madison, Wisconsin, masking was okay among the general population. Our COVID policies for the con were not very much based on local guidance. We were much more conservative than local guidance. We were looking at the CDC and health studies and such, and you know, our rules supersede, you know, in convention spaces. The one point where local laws actually came to our rescue is in 2021, where the county that we were in, not the state, not the city, but the county, still had restrictions on how many people could gather in one place. And that's what got us out of an event that year, is that restriction.
Yeah. Just working with the Medical Reserve Corps when I was, you know, at about the time that I was, it was a really fluid environment, and it really has remained a very fluid environment in terms of like recommendations, you know. I mean, you know, doing what you do, you know, just the lead up to knowledge of figuring out what this bug is doing at any given time is a challenge. So I think what really complicated that even more was the lack of a federal response at the very beginning, because then it became very much a hyper-local set of, you know, patchwork decisions made at the state level, the local level. So as a result, it's hard to answer that question, because the variables just started getting mixed up like a gigantic tossed salad ever afterwards. So I think that's why the conservative response tends to be most frequently adopted, because at that point you're removing layers and layers of confusion from everything. It's sort of like, all right, let's just make sure everyone's safe. You know, we don't know what the situation is, we don't know what it's going to be, and that's another consideration too, is you could make a COVID policy, you know, several months before the event, and everything changes around COVID over the 6 months that, you know, that it elapsed once the con actually gets run. So it's, yeah.
That's why you see a lot of cons like lifting or changing the policies like weeks before the con, and it does upset vendors, especially if we're vendors and we're forced to be in the vendor hall with unmasked people. Then a lot of vendors have rebelled against this. And actually, Worldcon was actually my first science fiction con, because I went to Johns Hopkins, so I was familiar with that area. That area presents a unique, I think, in terms of con running, people who staff like Worldcon are like the same people who staff Oldacon, Baltimore Comic Con, MagFest. So you have already a preset local group of con runners, which if they have codified a certain law, it makes it easier to transition from one con to another, as opposed to, I guess, individual cons that have like local smaller groups that run it. And I noticed that's become an issue, because if one massive group of regional con runners are able to change or affect a certain thing, smaller ones might not be able to adjust, or they might be able to adjust faster depending on rules that change.
Yeah, we had an evolving COVID policy. You just kind of have to, you know, new science comes out, etc. But we tried to keep it evolving in a conservative direction. So we never even considered getting rid of a mask mandate, nothing like that. Our understanding what fully vaccinated meant had to change, but you know, we always held on to that one. And the idea there is that we promised our in-person attendees a certain level of safety and comfort insofar as their personal calculus went. You know, like everyone does that calculus every day. You know, are you gonna eat in a restaurant? Are you gonna eat in a patio?
Yes.
And you know, we know that people are doing that math in their head all the time, and we want as few of those variables to change as possible. Anything that's under our control, we want to keep those promises.
I think we have time for probably one more question. All right, I think we have one more
Are there
question.
questions on AirMeet?
Yeah.
Oh, we have a question on AirMeet? Sure.
So given the increased workload of all of these, do you think the 100% volunteers by the community for the community model can survive long term? Is there anything we can do to help promote and to promote it and help it survive as volunteer commenters?
Everyone get that?
Ooh.
Who wants to tackle that?
Can you repeat that to the mic?
Loaded question.
Alex,
Yes.
can you repeat the question for us?
I don't think I even got it.
Do you think that a con can be continued to be run if it's a 100% volunteer run? Is that sustainable?
Okay. Do we think a con is sustainable if it could continue to be 100% volunteer run? And I think that's an issue most cons go through. So who wants to tackle this one?
We ran into this hardcore. So WizCon is, you know, entirely volunteer run. But the thing is, we ended up having to do major fundraising drives to stay alive this year. Not all cons do fundraising that way. What we do is we have very cheap tickets. They're $65. And everything else that we do is from donations. So we've really had to reckon with how sustainable that is. We don't really have an answer. What we end up doing is basically relying on those members who can give us more. But it's also like, we are like ethically opposed to charging more to physically attend our event. For example, like we're really cheap, and I don't know, we just have to do more drives. It's hard.
Just gonna shout out virtual events again. Low overhead. But we were able to actually pay our staff. It was like a small honorary, but it was something. And that isn't normal in the field. It should be, but we are definitely moving into kind of a period where everyone is expecting compensation for their work as they should. And so the field is going to have to kind of contend with that. We also had cheap tickets. They were $40. We also accepted donations. We also did sponsorships. We also sold merch, I think, in the second year, something like that. So you have to get a little creative, but definitely being able to compensate your staff should be part of that baseline kind of P&L situation, along with all of your accessibility things, hiring captioners, ASL interpreters, or whatever. Being able to pay your staff should be baked in to whatever it is you're doing, and should your needs for an expanded staff, kind of grow, you should have avenues to be able to pay them.
I have a question for you, actually.
Yeah.
Did you get any money from grants?
We did at Worldcon. We got
Fire
grants
funding,
from the
no.
state.
Yeah.
We didn't get grants.
Yeah, I was asking about FICOM.
Nah. I don't think we applied for any. I don't think. I was just gonna say, I mean, the discussions about whether cons are sustainable volunteer run are, not a new COVID thing. They've been around for a long time, and I've never sat down and tried to calculate what it would cost to to compensate the people who run a Worldcon, but I'm pretty sure the Worldcon would be many times over not viable. So it would be a substantial shift. What I think for COVID-19 is just that we have, in some cases we have increased the volunteer load at a time when I think fewer people are able to volunteer, because the atmosphere now that we're living under, a lot of times people do not have that free time, that maybe free kind of bandwidth that they had to volunteer to do these things. And also I think a lot of people are just more, feels like people are more on edge, people are more stressed, and then like the experience of becoming a volunteer, could become less fun. just because people are kind of reacting in different ways, I think. I'm not sure I'm putting that well, but just it feels like a slightly different environment to be a volunteer in, and I'm a little worried that, you know, the stress is gonna drive away more volunteers, at a time when we're putting an increased stress on them. We almost need more to kind of cope with some of the new challenges. You know, if registration, if we're gonna be checking, you know, COVID vaccinations, then we need to maybe double the registration staff for every convention in the future, and things like that. We probably need another hour to discuss how to compensate for staff.
I think actually we do need to wrap up. We're 1 minute left. So I want every panelist to have a chance to plug their social media, plug themselves, and I think that'll do it. So I guess we'll start down.
Hey, for those of you who weren't in the room earlier when I mentioned this, my big thing is I'm working on a Hugo Award category for games and other interactive works. If you want to help make that happen, please come to the business meeting either late in the Saturday session, which is unlikely, or early in the Sunday session, which is more likely. I will tweet about it. My Twitter is It's Just Era, ITSJUST, Era, IRA. It's Just Era. Follow me there for Games Hugo news.
I'm LD Lewis. You can find me mostly on Twitter complaining about things. It's it's L the villain, ELLE, the villain, and then follow or FIA's website is FIYAHLitmag.com, and there you can learn more about all of the various, probably too many other projects we're doing.
So during the pandemic, I started a podcast like everyone does. And you can find us on Twitter at OctoTalkcast, and we talk about science fiction and science fiction fandom. So we spend quite a lot of time, or have spent quite a lot of time, talking about, you know, COVID policies and different approaches to COVID. So if you want to hear me talk about this for infinitely more depth, you can go and listen to our episodes there.
Dan Berger and World Watch One is the Buckaroo Banzai newsletter that I've been associated with for a couple of decades now. You can find our page on Facebook at just search for World Watch One, or you can find most of our back issues on the Buckaroo Banzai Frequently Asked Questions website. I forget the address for that, but again, that is a quick Google away. So there you have it.
And I run the Con History Project. It's at Con History on Twitter, conhistory.com. We're tracking the history of conventions. I'm also doing a podcast where I interview people from past conventions, modern conventions, talking about their experience in the convention scene. You can find me in the dealer's hall. And with that, thank you all very much for coming to the panel. Thank you to all the panelists. And we hope you guys have a good rest of your time here at Worldcon. Enjoy yourselves. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, that was fun.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
And yes, Games Hugo.
Oh, yeah.
Games Hugo, but I've now got a shift on Sunday morning, so I'm gonna have to try and get out of it.
It will probably